Gold digger mom stole my entire college fund for her fourth wedding. So I crashed the ceremony wearing a custom t-shirt exposing her and got her arrested. I lost my grandma when I was 18. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman who ran her own upholstery business for 5 decades and raised 3 kids. My mom, being the middle child, often clashed with her. When I was young, I would often see my grandma and my mom fighting for small things and would wonder why, until I realized that my grandma hated my mother because of me. For context, according to my aunt, my parents never really wanted me. They harbored resentment towards me from the moment I came into the world. For the initial 6 months of my life, I lived with her and my grandma. However, when I started growing up, my grandma forced my parents to buckle up and take responsibility. As a child, I remember I was subjected to numerous derogatory names by my parents, particularly from my dad, like Bimbo or Dumbo, if I made a slight mistake, which was really hurtful to hear. Interestingly, despite these labels, I happened to be the most academically inclined among my cousins. Thanks to my parents' encouragement from a young age, I've developed a passion for pursuing a science degree. My parents would beat me up for what seemed like trivial reasons, such as wearing nail polish or talking to a boy. My dad never let me wear makeup, disapproved of my tight clothes, even if it's just yoga pants with a long shirt, and basically anything associated with being a girl. Keep in mind that I was still growing, and his controlling nature affected me a lot. When my parents used to fight, it always seemed to somehow become my fault. On top of that, my mom consistently complained that I didn't contribute around the house. The reality was that I was taught from a very early age to help them out. I folded at least 2 loads of laundry every day, cleaned one of the bathrooms daily, handled the dishes, and took care of various other chores like sweeping the floors. Despite all this, I never uttered a complaint about it, but my parents never appreciated it. It felt like I was an unappreciated maid at their home. Back then, I used to do most of the things my parents told me to do and avoided anything they didn't mention. I refrained from drinking, stayed away from drugs, and made sure not to wear what they deemed exposing clothes. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to go out with friends, even for birthdays, and having them over was also off limits. There were times when I'd come up with excuses to stay later at school during the daytime because I enjoyed spending time with others outside the confines of my home. However, everything changed when my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Even though I hated my dad for always trying to control my life, I still didn't want him to die, but my mom clearly didn't think this way. She left my dad, saying she did not want to be stuck with an ill husband. My dad and I were shocked when we watched her pack her bags and leave. Later, my dad broke down sitting on the porch. Even though I was just 14 years old, I could understand his pain. I had always seen him sit and drink a beer on the porch whenever he was having a bad day, so when I heard him crying, I got him a beer from the fridge. My dad started bawling when he noticed that I was handing him the beer, and he understood that I was trying to comfort him in the only way I knew. Since that day, I don't know how or why, but everything changed between me and my dad. He was not rude or abusive to me anymore. I can even venture to say that he was a good father after my mom left. In the following weeks, my parents got divorced, which was easy since my dad had a prenup with her and she could not take any alimony. By next month, my mom had already moved in with her new boyfriend, who was apparently her high school sweetheart, Morty. During this time, my mom hated having me for the weekends. Whenever my dad would drive me to drop me off, she would make up some excuses about why she could not see me that weekend. It really hurt me because it felt like my mom had divorced me along with my dad. Throughout all this, my grandma continued to visit me and I loved spending time with her. She would call me and all my cousins once a month to have a sleepover at her house, which is still one of my favorite memories to date. 5 months after my parents' divorce, my mom got married again. Her high school sweetheart, Morty, bought a house for my mom in hopes that they could grow their family together. However, my mom had other plans. Whenever I would get to visit her, which was rare, I would always find my mom on her phone giggling and talking to someone with not a care in the world. She would only cut off the call once it was time for Morty to come back home. Apparently, Morty eventually found out that she had been cheating with another guy and they had a huge fight. However, my mother managed to convince him that it was just a one-time mistake, so they stayed together. During this time, my dad's health was not improving from his cancer. In his last days, he would spend time with me as much as he could. I would come back home from school terrified, thinking something might have happened to him. Unfortunately, one night, my dad passed away in his sleep after months of chemo not working. My grandma and my dad's family were the first ones to reach me, as I just could not stop crying. When my mom came over, she was alone and there was no Morty in sight. I did not know this then, but my mom had continued to talk to the other guy behind Morty's back and he had finally left. Throughout my dad's funeral, my mom kept saying how my dad's death could not have come at a worse timing since she was already dealing with a lot. Everyone was so shocked and irritated by her callousness. When dad's will was left, it was declared that all his assets would be going to me. Immediately, my mother seemed very interested to be back in my life. However, my grandma did not want me living with my mother since she knew the kind of daughter she had raised. She knew my mother wanted me for the money my dad had left behind for me. She and my aunt helped me sell all my dad's assets so they could open a college trust fund in my name. However, because I was still a minor, my mother's name also had to be added. Meanwhile, Morty, my mom's husband, divorced her during this period, and since they had no prenup, she ended up with a substantial settlement. That's why Grandma warned her not to dip into my funds, emphasizing that she already had her own money. My mom agreed to this arrangement. When Mom and I started living together, it felt at first like I was living with a stranger. She had changed so much over the years and not in a good way at all. All she ever did was behave like a teenager herself. She would get dressed up and go out every night. She would come back home late at night with strange men and take them into her bedroom. Every morning, I would walk into the kitchen and notice someone different. It became a daily routine. When I turned 16, my mom introduced me to her third husband, Joe. Right from the start, it was clear he didn't like me. His behavior towards me was mean and unnecessarily critical. Whenever I raised the issue with my mom, she confronted him, leading to even more covert and behind-the-back hostility. Then, when my brother arrived 10 months later, my mom's narrative shifted to paint Joe as a good person deep down and that apparently he struggled to express himself. I was encouraged not to resent him but to be more understanding. However, Joe has no issues showering love on my baby brother, Brad. Oddly, my mom confided in me several times that she had nothing in common with Joe but she had married him because he would provide us with a stable family. This was far from the truth because my mom and Joe would have nasty fights especially after Brad was born. Joe did not want my mother to spend any time with me and would yell at her if she was not anywhere near Brad. He would tell me things like how he wished I would have died with my dad or I lived with my grandma because he wanted his son to get all the love and attention. It was hurtful and mentally exhausting to live with them where I was clearly not wanted. Every time I would beg or question my mother about why she stayed with him, she would skillfully change the subject. One day my mother and Joe left us with my grandma so they could go out with their mutual friends and have a good time. This had initially started as once or twice a month but had moved on to them doing it almost every weekend. They would usually ask me to watch Brad while they were out, but that night I was studying for my exam so they dropped us both off at Grandma's. I loved spending time with her and she usually cooked really tasty dishes for me while I could study peacefully. Brad was playing with his toys on the living room floor. My grandma had strictly told my parents that they should be back by 11 o'clock to pick us up. However, even after 11 p.m. my parents had not come back. I was starting to get worried as I had my exams the next day and I also needed to put Brad to bed on time, otherwise Joe would yell at me. Meanwhile, my grandma kept calling and left 3 angry messages for my parents. At 12 a.m., Joe and my mom finally showed up in their car completely blank out, drunk and giggling like teenagers. They reeked of alcohol and we were shocked that they had even managed to drive here without getting caught. Joe went to pick up Brad while my mother asked me to gather my things so we could drive back. However, my grandma put her foot down. She yelled at them for showing up this late and also being so drunk, which was dangerous for all of us. She told Joe that she could not let him take his son in this state and that we should call an Uber for us and leave the car at her place. However, Joe started fighting with my grandma, telling her to mind her own business and how he was the father so he knew what was best for his son. Tensions escalated quickly, with heated exchanges of curses between my grandma and Joe. My mom stood by saying nothing, clearly drunk out of her mind and unable to process things. I could feel the tension rising so I pleaded for them to stop, reminding them they were scaring my brother. But my words fell on deaf ears, the yelling persisted, and Joe started throwing insults at my grandma and me, saying how he never liked us but tolerated us for the sake of my mother. This made my grandma more pissed and in a fit of frustration, she threatened to call the police. Hearing this, Joe, who was clearly drunk and yelling like a maniac, did the worst thing that I have ever seen anyone do. He slapped my grandma. I screamed in horror as Joe's hand connected with my grandma's face, the sound echoing through the room. "Stop it. Just stop," I yelled, but Joe did not even glance at me while Brad started to cry, clearly traumatized. My grandma, holding her cheek, yelled for me to call the police as my mother watched in horror. I don't even remember what I told the 911 operator as I was crying too much. Fortunately, the person understood and stayed with me on call until the police arrived. When Joe noticed the approaching sirens, panic crossed his face. Suddenly he started to beg my grandma, pleading with desperation in his eyes. He begged her not to press charges, insisting it would ruin his life and my mom's life. In the end, Joe was charged with assault and taken away in handcuffs. He kept pleading with my mom to help bail him out, but my mom, who had stood frozen earlier, started to cry and yell at him. My grandma made it clear to my mom that if she did not divorce that guy she would involve the CPS also and she would lose both her children. My mother simply nodded, clearly looking terrified. It was only later that I found out that Joe and my mom had also tried drugs that night along with alcohol. The reason she escaped not getting arrested that night is because she was mostly silent, unlike Joe. That night, I and Brad stayed at my grandma's place because I refused to be with her alone as I was so disappointed and traumatized. Thankfully, the next day, when my mother came to her senses, she realized just what her husband had done. She filed for divorce and forbade him from ever seeing us. When the rest of the family found out about what Joe had done, they all came down on my mom, and rightfully so. Everyone had questions, and rightly so. Why did it take so long for my mom to take action? Why didn't she see the signs earlier? My aunt and uncle yelled at my mom until she started to cry. They were so pissed that they vowed to never speak to her ever again for what her husband had done. As per Joe's charges, since he was a first-time offender, the court imposed him with probation. During this period, Joe had to attend counseling and was ordered to stay away from us. He could only see his son if my mother allowed, and she was present as well. He did try to beg my mother for forgiveness, but my mother didn't listen and divorced his manipulative ass. She got a lot from him in the settlement and has since been living a good life. I did not want to stay with my mom after the Joe incident, so I moved all my things to my grandma's place while Brad stayed with my mom. My mom didn't like this arrangement one bit since she depended on me to babysit my brother, but she could not say anything to me for fear that my grandma would chew her off. This year, I celebrated my 18th birthday. I was so excited to finally be an adult and start a new phase of my life. However, life had other plans for me. My grandma passed away just a week after my birthday. She had a heart attack, and it was completely unexpected since she did not have any heart problem. After her funeral, the whole family was informed that she had drawn up a will to divide her assets. For my mom and aunt, she had equally divided up her family heirlooms and jewelry, which were quite expensive. For her oldest son, my uncle, she had left him her car, which he had always loved. For my cousins, she had divided her money to be put in for their college trust funds. For me, she had left her most important asset, her house. Apparently, because I was the closest to my grandma among all and had been living with her, she did not want me to go back home to my mom ever again. I was shocked and started to cry tears of joy, as her house meant a lot of happy memories for me. Unfortunately, my grandma didn't leave Brad with anything. I don't know if she simply forgot, or maybe it was because Brad was just my half-brother. Needless to say, my mom was livid with my grandma's. She flat out said that giving me a house was worth so much more than her jewelry, and it simply wasn't fair for her mother to leave me so much. No one else, except my mother, had any complaint, since they all understood that my grandma had left us with things that we all deserved. My mother then got angry that Brad did not get anything and started to badmouth my grandma, saying how she was such a selfish woman for not doing anything for her son. I got pissed and told her that she should be grateful that her mother decided to leave her anything at all after what her ex-husband did to her. Hearing this, my mother got pissed, saying how I had no right to bring up the past, which just made me scoff at her. Then she started to tell me how I should sell grandma's place and move in with her. I told her that I genuinely loved staying at the house and would never sell it since it meant more to me than money. My mother did try to urge me more, but I stood my ground. I have to say that it has been wonderful living on my own. I have always been surrounded by toxic people until I moved to my grandma's place permanently, and I have also never lived alone. However, I have been spending a lot of time with myself and going to therapy to deal with my grandma's death. With everything going on in my life, I decided to take a gap year. However, because I am no more a minor, I wanted to remove my mother from my trust fund. I needed her signature to access the funds and also to remove her from the beneficiaries. So I went to talk to my mother 2 months ago. She introduced me to her new boyfriend, Robin, who she had been seeing for weeks. Robin seemed like a pleasant guy, however quite younger than her, unlike all her previous ex-husbands. However, I knew better than to bring his age up, so I asked my mom to talk privately and she agreed. I expected things to go smoothly with her regarding my trust fund, since this was rightfully the money that my dad had left for me. However, my mother started to freak out when she heard that I wanted to remove her from the trust. I found this odd and told her how this was always the plan anyway, and now that I am 18 I would like to handle my own finances. She refused and told me that I was still young, and because I was anyway not going to college this year, I didn't need to remove her. Her behavior was starting to make me suspicious, but my mother kept insisting that I could always come to her when I started college. Later, I spent some time with Brad and left. It was only when I was driving back home did I realize that there was a chance that my mother could have been using my money from the funds, even though it seemed far-fetched at that time. I decided to consult a lawyer who could help me figure out the terms and conditions of the trust document. The lawyer reviewed and agreed that my mother needed to sign off for me to access the funds, however I could view its current value if needed. This is how I found out from the bank what my mother had been doing. Not only had my mother been withdrawing money from the trust fund in small amounts over the years, but after our recent conversation, she had completely wiped the account clean. I was horrified. It felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath me. The betrayal hit hard, leaving me grappling with a sense of betrayal and disbelief. I felt so pissed about what my mother had done. For days, I was crying and moping around the house, unable to understand why my mother would do something like this. No wonder, she did not want me to remove her from having access to my funds. I knew if I confronted her about it, she would just deny it or come up with a lame excuse. I felt like I needed to teach her a lesson. Just as luck would have it, my mom, who was oblivious that I knew about her backstabbing, called to let me know that she was getting married yet again. She was excitedly talking about how Robin was definitely the one, which almost made me roll my eyes, as this was the same shit I had heard from her with every guy. She told me how she was going to have a grand wedding to celebrate her love with Robin. I just wanted to yell and scream at her for being such a trashy parent and stealing my money, but I kept my mouth shut as I wanted to take my revenge. Since she was having a wedding, it gave me the perfect opportunity to come up with a plan. I decided to have a family meeting so I could rally all my cousins and trusted relatives for what I was about to do. I told them everything and showed them documents about how my mother had been withdrawing money from my college trust fund that had all the money that my dad had left behind for me and how she had wiped it clean when she knew that she would have no more access to it. As I shared the extent of her betrayal, the family's shock and disbelief mirrored my own when I first learned the truth. I told them how the timing of her wedding seemed off and she had probably withdrawn so much for her lavish wedding, and I wanted to humiliate her at this event before getting her arrested. My aunt and uncle were horrified that my mother could stoop so low and promised me that they would have my back. My cousins also agreed with my plan. My mother's wedding was last week. She had invited the entire family to her church wedding and grand reception with Robin. I decided to go to the wedding wearing a t-shirt that had the word "My mother's a gold digger" in bright red letters. I got this shirt custom made just for this occasion. Seeing my outfit, Robin and his family looked shocked while I just politely smiled and went to find my seat. My side of the family already knew about my plan, so they were ready. When my mother, oblivious to my plans, began her walk down the aisle, I remained seated. She did not even glance at me as she walked past, so my plan seemed to be working. During the ceremony, when the priest asked if anyone objected to the union of the couple, I knew this was my moment. I raised my hand in objection. The priest looked taken aback. However, along with me, my aunt, uncle and my cousins also raised their hands. My mother and Robin looked at us in horror as I rose from my seat. My mother finally realized the words on my t-shirt and her face turned red in embarrassment. In front of the assembled guests, I publicly accused my mother of stealing money from my college trust fund. Holding up documents, I exposed the details of her betrayal, emphasizing that she had stolen my hard-earned funds, leaving me without the means for college. Her face drained of color as whispers spread among the guests. I then asked her loudly why would she steal money from her own daughter when she had been married 3 times already and had received more than enough alimony in her previous 2 marriages. The room filled with gasps as Robin turned to my mother, clearly unaware of her actions. He asked her what I meant by 3 marriages when she had only told him about 1 marriage. My mother glared at me in anger and started to yell at me about how childish I was and that she had not stolen any of my money since she had every right to the money as she had been married to my father, and told me how I should be grateful to her that I was ever born. I yelled back at her that what she had done was illegal and that I was going to make sure she got arrested. However, my mom scoffed and told me how ungrateful I was, insisting it wasn't a big deal since she had practically raised me and the least I could do was let her have the money. She argued that, as my mother, she had every right to my money. That's when Robin chimed in. He asked my mother if this was why they had managed to afford such an extravagant wedding since my mother was footing the bill for everything. My mother kept quiet, which was basically her admitting to it. This is when all hell broke loose. I couldn't contain my anger and began yelling at her. The chaos escalated as my relatives joined in, expressing their outrage at my mom's despicable actions. Amidst the shouting, my mom retaliated, insisting it was a private matter between me and her and how they should not judge her for it. Things got physical when my aunt got too close while confronting her, leading to shoving between them. The chaos reached its peak, prompting someone to call the police. Eventually, my mom was arrested since she kept shouting and yelling when the police arrived and refused to settle down. I went to the police station with my aunt to give my statement. Since then, my mother has been charged with embezzlement and financial fraud. I can't believe this even when I am writing it because I never thought I would get my mother arrested. I can't believe she would do such a thing to me. Since her wedding, I have been receiving calls from everyone both out of concern and also indignation. Some of my distant relatives do think that I took things too far and that I should have never involved others in this matter or got my mom arrested. My side of the family believes that I did the right thing. However, this is such an extraordinary circumstance that I am forced to ask if I did go too far with my mom? Ida? Update 1. Thank you everyone for your kind words. When I posted this, I was overthinking and I felt really guilty since I have never really hated my mom, or at least I didn't until she pulled this shit. I never wanted to file a case against her and it still feels like I'm having a bad dream. However, I do understand that this is all the consequences of her own actions. To everyone who is worried about me, please don't worry because my uncle has helped me find a good lawyer who is confident that we will win this legal suit against my mom. My only goal is to recover my lost money, or at least as much as I can. Also, for anyone wondering about Brad, he is doing okay. He is still too young to understand what is happening. He is currently staying with Joe and his family since my mom's arrest. Update 2. It's been 6 months since my last update. I know a lot of you have been wondering about what happened, and I would like to clarify that I was not allowed to talk or write anything about the case since the legal proceedings were going on. In short, the court ruled in favor of me. My mother has been asked to pay back every penny of the money that she had stolen from me. She cried and begged, but the judge didn't budge. She now has to liquidate all her assets and probably also sell her house in order to pay me. It feels so good to write this since these last few months have been brutal on my mental health. The only thing that has kept me going is thinking of my grandma and dad. My grandma would have been proud that I stood up to my mom, and my dad would have wanted me to have his money so I could invest in my future. Update 3. It's been 3 months since I last updated here. How was everyone's New Year's? Mine was fantastic. My mother, facing the weight of her actions, has repaid the entire amount she had embezzled from my college trust fund. The legal proceedings compelled her to make amends, at least financially. I also made the difficult decision to sever ties with my mother permanently. The rest of my family echoed this sentiment, and we collectively decided to distance ourselves from her despite her trying to reach out to us as if she expected us to just forgive and forget this incident. Lately, I have been checking out brochures and thinking about what's next in 2024. The gap year has turned out to be amazing overall despite the legal proceedings. It has been a mix of figuring myself out and healing myself from the past trauma. Spending time with my cousins and other family members has always been a big part of moving forward. Golden child sister got kicked out by her husband for cheating. So our parents convinced me to let her move in, but then she started flirting with my husband. Hey, so there's a lot of context here, so I'll start with that first. I, 25, female, have a twin sister, Becky. She and I were close growing up, but something just went very wrong when she was a teenager. Becky was an exceptionally bright student, while I was quite average. So in 8th grade, she was offered a scholarship opportunity from a really reputed institution for gifted kids like her, and she wanted to accept. The only problem was that the high school that she was supposed to be attending was way out of town and the commute itself would take up more than an hour every day. We could have let her live on campus, but Becky wasn't fine with it because she said she didn't like the idea of living on campus. So after a lot of deliberation, my parents decided that she could live with our aunt, my father's sister. My aunt didn't have any kids of her own and had never married. So my father had been a little wary of sending Becky to live with her since he wasn't sure if she would be able to handle the responsibility. But my aunt herself had volunteered to take Becky in and let her live with her so she could attend the school that she wanted to and wouldn't jeopardize her future. And that's how Becky ended up living with my aunt for high school, while I continued to live with my parents. She would come back for the holidays and we would all visit her whenever we had the time. For the first couple of months, everything was going fine and she would tell us that she was having the time of her life at her new school since everybody was like-minded and she was finally being challenged. I was really happy for her because I wanted her to succeed. I had never been one of the typically jealous kids, I just wanted everyone to be happy, and I guess that still remained the same. So initially when she would tell me about her school and her new friends, I would be happy for her. And she wouldn't make a big deal out of it either, she would just mention it casually in conversation, but over time, that started to change. And it felt like she was trying to rub it in my face and make me feel bad about it. For a while, I thought that I was just reading too much into it. But then there were a lot of other negative changes in her behavior as well, which my parents also picked up on gradually. And that made me think that maybe I wasn't reading enough into this and something was going really wrong with Becky. This wasn't instantly noticeable and it took a lot of time for us to actually come to terms with the fact that Becky was becoming much more different and kind of worse as a person. It started off small, like whenever we would visit her, she wouldn't talk as much as she used to and always seemed to have an attitude. But we brushed it off thinking that she was probably just stressed and tired from school and needed time to herself. My aunt also said the same thing and we were satisfied with that explanation. But then more time passed and then she would get snappy and cranky at us for absolutely no reason. My parents were also told that her grades were slipping and she was becoming quite troublesome to have in class. That was in her junior year and that's the point around which my parents really started to get worried. They had been talking about bringing her back home for quite some time, but she was straight up refusing to come back. Because she wanted to be amongst people like her and didn't think that she would ever fit into the high school that I went to, which was quite an insult for me, if I'm being honest. Anyway, the final straw was when my parents were contacted in the middle of the night by my aunt and she claimed that Becky had stolen a bunch of cash and disappeared. There was a police search and she was found just half an hour after the phone call, trying to purchase drinks even though she was underage. She was let off with a warning, but my parents decided that they had enough and it was time to bring her home. Becky was very unhappy about it and made sure that she put up a really good fight and was even more rebellious than she had been before. She protested a lot, but my parents had enough and they forced her to come back with us and start attending the same high school that I used to go to. They also pushed her into therapy because clearly, something had gone wrong while she had been living with my aunt. At first, we had honestly assumed that she hadn't been able to compete with the kids at her school and had finally snapped and broken down. Because when she came back, she was really difficult to deal with. She refused to cooperate with anyone, be it our parents or even the teachers at our school. She would be nasty to our classmates and would constantly skip class. And even though I couldn't prove it to my parents, I had seen her smoking a little distance away from the school building several times. She had turned into the complete opposite of what she used to be, and it had been a slow but drastic change. So of course my parents thought that therapy would be the best way to go forward so we could at least get to the bottom of what really had gone wrong while she was living with my aunt. We had expected the problem to be the school or bullying, but unfortunately, it turned out to be my aunt herself. So apparently, my aunt was what one could refer to as a helicopter parent. While in therapy, Becky was able to open up and she had claimed that our aunt was really overbearing and simply too controlling. She would pretend to be normal whenever we came around to visit her, but the second that we left, she would turn back into her usual self and try to control every single aspect of her life. She said that she was forced to study every single second that she was at home because everything else was apparently just a waste of time. She was not allowed to go out with her friends or do anything apart from studying while she was at home. Even when she would have lunch or dinner, my aunt insisted on playing something educational, instead of letting her watch something fun. It was really frustrating for her, so she started to act out in other ways. But she wasn't willing to go back to us either because that would mean giving up on the opportunity of a lifetime. And she didn't want to go to a normal public school because that would mean demeaning her own capabilities. Our aunt had told her several times that apparently, our grandparents had never recognized her talent or intellect even though she had also been a gifted child. And because her parents had never recognized that she was special and different, they never treated her differently either, and she ended up with a boring job that didn't even pay enough. She claimed that she could have been doing so much better if her parents had actually bothered to put in the time and effort to do something about how intelligent she was and invested in her. She had drilled the fear of failure into Becky and made her very paranoid, which is why she had refused to come back home with us the first time around. She believed that if she gave up on this school, it would spell nothing but failure for her in the future. And so she tried to keep up, but the pressure was just getting to her, so she started thinking about drinking and sneaking off to go out with her friends to let off some steam. But she got caught in the process, and now she was back here with us. She said that she regretted everything because she had let go of a brilliant opportunity to actually make something of herself, and now, she knew that she was doomed to failure. So she didn't even see the point of trying to do better anymore and had completely given up on herself. It was clear to us after that our aunt had really done a number on her and how. But the worst part was when a couple of years passed with minimal improvement in her behavior, and Becky was then diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. I couldn't say that I was surprised, but it was heartbreaking to know that our aunt had actually led to her developing such a serious disorder that was going to affect her for the rest of her life. Our parents were obviously devastated because they blamed themselves for even allowing our aunt to take over and letting Becky stay with her. However, I didn't think it was completely their fault because they had noticed all the signs and tried to get Becky back home, but she was the one who had refused. And also, our aunt pretended to be really normal and was good at it whenever we were around, so there was no way that we could have found out unless Becky herself told us about it. They even filed a lawsuit against her to try and get her to pay us for the damage that she had caused, and actually won. All that money went into Becky's treatment because she needed intensive therapy for several years. She managed to graduate from high school with great difficulty but couldn't go to college because she was not in the correct condition, and my parents didn't want to risk anything by sending her away again. She refused to attend community college, so she continued to live with our parents until a few years ago. She started dating this guy called Toby, who moved in next door by himself after our old neighbors sold their house and moved away. He knew everything about her because our parents felt like it was their duty to tell him when they noticed that Becky was growing closer to him, and often found her making excuses to speak to him. He was actually a really kind and compassionate person who genuinely seemed to like her. He didn't even care about her diagnosis and reassured my parents that he really liked her and wanted to go out with her in spite of everything that he had been told. My parents weren't exactly on board with it, but Becky convinced them to let her move in with him after they had been dating for a couple of months. It certainly helped that he lived next door and my parents could always just pop in to make sure that she was doing alright. So they agreed after a while because it was getting really difficult to justify keeping a full-grown adult woman under their constant supervision. Becky ended up moving in with Toby, and my parents continued to try and make sure she wasn't doing anything to jeopardize her future and her relationship. They had also found her a job in a friend's startup company as a receptionist around the same time because she was apparently getting sick of being stuck at home. They found her the receptionist job so that it could be something low pressure for her to start with and she could eventually work her way up. And everything was going great for her. After almost a year of living together, they decided to get married, and since they were already living together, my parents agreed because they thought that this would do a lot of good for her. She even quit her job to be a full-time stay-at-home wife. And honestly speaking, being with Toby had actually brought about a lot of positive changes in her life, and she was even behaving better with all of us, instead of constantly treating us like the enemy and acting like she could do so much better if we didn't exist to bring her down. So they thought that it was a good idea, and she got married 2 years ago. I only just got married last year to my boyfriend, whom I've been with for almost 7 years. We met in our first year of college and have been inseparable since then. My husband Jack has always known about Becky, ever since I brought him home to meet my family for the first time, and Becky started flirting with him like nobody's business. I'd told him about Becky's diagnosis and said that she might act a little strange, but I didn't expect her to start flirting with him right in front of me. It was really inappropriate, and I had to ask her to stop multiple times before my mother finally snapped at her and told her to go back to her room. It was really awkward afterward, and we had to explain to him that this was just how she was and there was no telling what she might say or do because she literally had no filter. She would oftentimes say things to irk us on purpose, and trying to flirt with my boyfriend would definitely get it done. But that was their first interaction, and after that, Jack would just ignore her, and she got bored after the first few attempts when she tried to flirt with him, but it wasn't reciprocated, and started ignoring him back. So they never really got along, and neither did I think it was necessary for them to do so either, and left the situation alone. But she had been invited to my wedding as I had been invited to her, since my parents wanted us to at least pretend to be a happy family even if we weren't one. She was totally smitten by Toby, and once they were together, she had started being nice to everybody, so I didn't think that there was any harm in finally being a family again. We started off well with monthly family dinners and were really trying our best to mend our relationships and be a little less dysfunctional. And it was really working because we had made a lot of progress in the past couple of years, and I guess one could actually refer to us as a happy family now. But I guess it was too good to be true because we recently found out that Becky had been cheating on Toby for the past year or so. We were all really shocked to find out about it because we had always assumed that Toby and Becky were as in love as could be. And yet she went ahead and had an affair with one of his co-workers, no less. It was a huge scandal for the family, and Toby filed for divorce as soon as he found out. He'd found out about it by chance because Becky had left her phone unlocked around him and left the room, and unfortunately, that's when her affair partner decided to drop a text. It was almost as if he wasn't even trying to hide it by that point. I guess she got lazy because she had been cheating on him for over a year and getting away with it, which is probably why she slipped up. Either way, there was no talking him into taking her back, and I don't exactly blame the guy because who would take her back after what she did? After quite a lengthy divorce process, it was decided that they would sell all their property, and that included the house. So Toby sold the house and split the money between the two of them. Becky lived with our parents for some time after the divorce, but my parents kept telling me to let her live with me instead because she complained that my parents being around made her feel like a total loser who was still living with her mom and dad after a failed marriage. She could just rent an apartment and live on her own, but apparently, my parents didn't want that, because they thought that she might hurt herself or do something stupid if she was left to her own devices. My parents were practically begging me to take her in so she could rebrand her life. After a while, I didn't see the point of declining it over and over again, so I ended up agreeing to it and took her in. I honestly felt bad for her because every time I would visit my parents' house after the divorce, she would just be lurking in the shadows like a ghost of her past self. And it was pretty pathetic to see. I don't think anybody in my place could have continued to ignore it, and at the end of the day, she was my sister and I owed my family certain things. Or at least that's what I believed before I took her in, and she decided to stab me in the back. Anyway, a while after the divorce, I decided to speak to my husband about this. We had quite a few discussions regarding Becky and the living arrangement that my parents had been suggesting, and we decided that we were okay with it. Because if it was going to help with self-esteem and make her a better person somehow, then I was all for it. So we took her in a couple of days ago, and she managed to screw it up in less than a week. She was quite happy to move in with us, and I could tell that my parents had been right. She really did want to live with me instead of them. It was kind of strange because she and I had grown apart in the years after she went away to live with our aunt. It was nice to see that she was finally reconnecting with me, and I even thought that we could really rebuild our relationship again. I was wrong obviously, and I never should have taken her in. I only did it as a favor to my parents and a little bit to her because we all knew that she was in over her own head, and I wanted to do something to fix the family. Call it my savior complex, but I just wanted to be helpful. The day that she moved in was actually pretty nice. We let her stay in the guest room, and she really made herself at home there. She was chirpy and lively that day, and this was the first time that I had seen her this happy ever since the divorce took place. So I, for one, was really happy that I was being of help. However, things started changing as soon as we had spent one day in our house. The very next day she started picking apart stupid things like how I decorated my house and the kind of paint that I used for the walls. It was ridiculous. But I didn't say anything about it because it seemed too petty to make an issue out of. The last straw was when, at dinner, she decided to start flirting with my husband. I'm not even kidding, it was like full-on flirting, and she didn't even seem to care that I was sitting right there. She kept asking him weird questions and making googly eyes at him throughout dinner, and I could tell that he was really uncomfortable, as was I. On more than one occasion, she brushed her hand against his on purpose when there was really no need to. I was actually speechless, and my husband and I left the dinner table as soon as we could without even bothering to finish our dinner. We went to our room for a bit and immediately decided that she had to go because there was no way that I was letting Becky live under my roof and flirt with my husband. It was just not going to happen, and she would just have to go back to living with our parents. If that affected her mental health, then tough, but that's not my problem because she's not my daughter. I tried to do something nice for the family by taking in a nutcase like her, but obviously, there is no fixing people like this because they're always just going to be ungrateful. I should have known that, but I guess the human part of me really did feel bad for her and wanted to make her feel better because she is my sister. After we were done with dinner, and our conversation, I called my parents and told them what had happened. I expected them to be just as outraged as I was and demand that I send her back immediately. A third move back to her parents' place would just be devastating for her, and she would go back to mopping and sulking all the time. They didn't want that for her and told me that I could either just deal with it or I could let her have this house and move somewhere else. I didn't even know what they meant by let her have this house because that's not how things work. You can't just let people have things that don't belong to them. And that applies to both husbands and houses. Anyway, I told my parents that they were being ridiculous and they had to take her back in. But my parents said that I was overreacting and that it was apparently no big deal because, as long as I trusted my husband, I had nothing to worry about. As for my sister, she was going through a really difficult time and I should just overlook all the strange things that she was going to say or do and just keep her around because as a part of the family, I owe this to them and I have to help out. That's when I snapped at them and told them that I didn't really owe them anything because this was their daughter, not mine, and it was their responsibility to take care of her. Earlier I did think that I owed them something, which is why I brought her in, but now that it backfired, I wasn't going to entertain it anymore. It just didn't make sense. My parents and I went back and forth for a couple of minutes, after which they told me that I could either get a new home or just put up with my sister because I had already taken her in, and they were not going to force Becky to relocate once more just because I was insecure. And then they hung up without giving me a chance to reply. My husband and I were really mad because this was insanely entitled and I couldn't believe that they actually thought that this was going to work. We went back out into the living room where Becky was and decided to tell her that the way she had behaved was extremely inappropriate, and we were not comfortable with her living with us anymore. Her reaction to that was nothing sort of crazy, and she instantly started screaming at me, accusing me of being jealous of her all my life. She said that the only reason she had even wanted to move in with us was because she wanted to be closer to my husband and not me. Apparently, she had seen the way he used to look at her whenever we would come over during or even after the divorce, and she knew that he wanted to make a move, but I was the only one who stopped him from doing that. So she had taken it upon herself to move in with us and make it easier for him to confess his feelings. My husband and I were actually dumbstruck when she said that because of the sheer incredulity of it. A few seconds later, my husband told her to get out and never come back, and that's when she seemed really surprised because she hadn't seen this coming. She tried to seem indignant and said that she knew what she had witnessed and he was only trying to cover up his tracks now because he didn't want to mess things up with me. I lost my temper and I screamed at her to get out, so she screamed right back and told me that she was leaving anyway because she had no interest in living with us since we were nothing but a bunch of losers anyway. So she packed her things up quickly and left. We didn't know where she went, and after that, we just wanted a quiet night, so we went to sleep. But unfortunately, my parents have not been able to find her yet since she hasn't been answering any calls, and she definitely didn't go to their place. So we basically have no idea where she is. Long story short, my parents are blaming me for it. They think that my husband and I made this happen, which is really unfair. But I do feel kind of guilty because had we been a little kinder to her, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. So Ida for kicking my narcissistic sister out of my house? Update 1. Okay, so it's been a few days since my post here and I just wanted to tell you guys that we found her. Becky had been crashing at a friend's place who lives a little out of town, and that's why we hadn't been able to trace her. But she is okay, and just as delusional and crazy as ever. When my parents found her, she refused to come back with them because she claimed that she was too good to be living with her family anymore and wanted a place of her own. She said that she was sick of relying on people, first on Toby and then on my parents. So she wanted a home of her own, and guess what? My parents agreed to it. Of course, there has been no apology to me yet or my husband. My parents just put all this in a message and told me that I should be grateful that nothing bad had happened to her. They told me that they would be buying her a new apartment at the earliest so she could save her own money and start afresh now. I don't know why they thought that this was a necessary detail for me to know. But it's great that they told me, so now I know exactly where I stand. Clearly, my happiness is not very important to them. And at least now I know that. Update 2. It happened, they got her a new apartment. At least this time they didn't text me in person to tell me about it. I found out from a bunch of our friends because she was posting about it relentlessly on social media. And after we kicked her out, she had blocked us everywhere. Probably out of embarrassment because of the crazy incident. Either way, I don't mind it at all. My friends said I don't really know what she is up to because she's just not worth my time. I tried to be nice to her, but that blew up in my face magnificently. Now I'm done and I don't want to ever have any interaction with her again. She's just not worth my time and energy. My parents and I still haven't spoken, and I guess they still think that I'm responsible for Becky going missing for those couple of days, even though nothing really happened to her, and she got her way in the end. She should probably be happy that I kicked her out because that's what got her the new apartment. Either way, my husband and I are doing great and he's my only family as of now. Update 3. Hey, so it's been 1 month since Becky came over, flirted with my husband, and got herself kicked out of my house promptly. And then, like you all know, my parents bought her a new apartment to live in with their money instead of the money from the alimony because they wanted her to be able to save. It's crazy that it's been such a long time since then, and yet nothing seems to have changed with either Becky or my parents. Neither of them has gotten back to me to apologize, and I have stopped holding out hope that they will at any point. Some people are just too selfish to think about anybody else apart from themselves, and I should know that Becky actually was a narcissist. She should probably start therapy again. But I'm not gonna tell her that because she's not my family anymore. My husband and I are still going strong and happy, and that's all that matters to me. My parents and Becky can take a hike. Narcissistic Mill convinced her 11-year-old grandson to lock me in a dark closet as a prank. When my husband refused to help, I called the cops. Me and my husband's family don't have a good history, especially my Mill. A little bit of a backstory: my husband, Kyle, is one of the 2 children in his family. He has always been the golden boy even though he had an older sister. My mother-in-law, Monica, is a full-blown, clinical narcissist. She was the type to demand gifts on my husband's or his sister's birthday, saying that they wouldn't be here without her. My husband has told me previously that while growing up, every time he achieved something, she made it about herself. When I first started dating my husband and coming around his house, Mill was nice as a pie, but her behavior progressively declined as we started to get more serious. She has gotten more and more crazier over the years. It really escalated when we decided to get married 3 years ago. My Mill would interfere and make trying to plan our wedding an absolute nightmare. Thankfully, me and my husband had decided right off the bat to pay for it ourselves to hopefully avoid anyone in our families inserting themselves into the process. Hence, when Mill tried to interfere and change our venue or layout of the wedding, I politely declined her suggestions. She complained to my husband, who tried to talk to me and compromise, but I told him that our decision was final. Now when it came to our wedding, I had always wanted a casual, fun, non-religious wedding and did a mismatched bridal party look from a loose color palette. The only thing I had asked Mill and the rest of my bridesmaids to do literally was pick out a dress that was within my color palette and then just run it by me before they purchased it, so I would know exactly what I was working with. My mother and the rest of the bridesmaids showed me their options, and I never told them no or asked them to change a thing from what they all picked. Mill never showed me any options. I kept asking for months leading up to the wedding and she would find some excuse. On the day of my wedding, my Mill showed up in an off-white dress to everyone's shock. It was a medium-length dress, with a transparent chiffon layer and a bolero. She looked triumphant as she smirked at me when she saw my face. I knew then and there that she was going to be a pain in my ass forever. I burst out crying and my husband immediately asked her to either change or leave the venue. Phil didn't want to drive her back and started to argue with my husband. In the end, to keep the family peace, I let Mill attend our wedding in her dress. I can't even say how embarrassing it was for the guests to notice her dress and be surprised. I ignored her throughout the wedding and didn't speak a single word to her. My husband knew how upset I was, and told me to let this issue go, saying that no matter who wore a white dress, I was the bride anyway. It really upset me that he didn't understand how callous his mother was to wear her dress in a color that no mother should wear to her son's wedding. I decided to forgive her for it, even though she never once apologized to me. Her narcissism didn't just stop there. When we were trying to get pregnant, it was a tough time for us. I had a miscarriage once, so when I found out that I was pregnant again, I was understandably quite nervous. Kyle was super excited to be a dad and understood why we couldn't share the news immediately with our family. He went with me to every doctor's appointment, read parenting books with me, and even set up a cute nursery for our baby. 2 months later, we decided it was time to share the exciting news about my pregnancy with our family. We made sure we crossed the crucial first trimester milestone and were completely certain before spreading the joy to our loved ones. We had invited all our parents, close family, and friends for lunch. They arrived, expecting a regular lunch, but upon noticing my growing stomach, their expressions shifted to expressions of joy and amazement. My mother started crying when she saw me and confirmed that I was indeed pregnant. She understood why we had kept the news secret and was overjoyed to be a grandmother soon. She completely understood why we had kept it a secret and expressed her excitement about becoming a grandmother soon. However, Kyle's mother, Monica, had a completely different reaction. Instead of sharing in the joy, she reacted angrily upon learning that we had kept the pregnancy hidden. She felt left out and accused me specifically of intentionally excluding her. Despite my attempts to explain the reason behind our decision, she continued to look pissed and refused to engage with me further. Her disapproval cast a shadow over what should have been a joyful family occasion. Throughout the night, Monica didn't address me at all. She displayed disrespect not only towards me but also towards my mother, who had always been nothing but kind to her during their previous encounters. Monica remained unresponsive during discussions, buried in her phone while everyone else engaged in the family gathering. It was clear that she was upset, and her discontentment was palpable. She openly expressed to everyone how she had no idea about my pregnancy, making her feel as if she had lost precious time with a grandchild who hadn't even been born yet. My husband and one of his brothers picked up on her frustration. As the tension escalated, I reached a breaking point and decided to step out for a moment to gather myself. My mother, who noticed my distress, came to comfort me until I felt composed enough to return. As the night came to an end, Monica made a deliberate point of saying goodbye to me last. The entire day, she had barely exchanged more than a hi and bye with me. Later, when my husband walked them to the car, they ended up having a heated argument which I could hear clearly standing in the foyer. Monica took the opportunity to vent her complaints about me, further escalating the strained situation. Thankfully, all our guests had left by this moment, so it was just me, my parents, Kyle, and his parents. She angrily told him that she couldn't believe that I had the audacity to keep this pregnancy from her and that I did not consider family at all. My husband calmly let her know that he and I had both decided to wait until we were out of the danger zone and that everything was fine before sharing the news with everyone. Hearing this, Monica started yelling. This is how their conversation went. Monica, this is our grandchild we're talking about. I deserve to know from the very beginning. As your mother, you should have called me immediately with the news. Kyle, Mom, We just wanted to be cautious before giving the good news. Monica, cautious? I am your mother. You should have trusted me with this. I know this is all her fault. You let her dictate whatever she wants. Grow a pair. Kyle's face got red in embarrassment and he looked at his mother miserably as she kept yelling more. I was unaware of the tears streaming down my face. The sharpness of her words had left me hurt and bewildered. I tried to intervene, but my mother stopped me by whispering to me that if I said anything right now, Monica would find a way to jump at me. This was absolutely true because I was sure Monica just wanted to fight with me, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. I kept my mouth shut. My Mill told him that he should open his eyes to see the truth as he was letting me control everything, and as his mother, she should have been the first to know if her son was having a child. Eventually, my Phil urged my Mill to calm down and drove her away. As you can imagine, this wasn't the last time she acted this way. Her list of blowing things out of proportion and acting entitled has been endless. Here is a list of other things. She tried to go behind my back and teach our baby to call her ma instead of grandma, which absolutely infuriated me. She will beg me to babysit our child and will then make sure that everyone knows how much she helps us around and how we always need her. When I had a few health issues after pregnancy, she would tell me that I needed to be a better mother to her grandbaby and should get over myself. Due to all these incidents above and many more, my relationship with my Mill has never been great, but I continue to tolerate her for the sake of my husband. Now coming on to what happened, my Mill and Phil recently moved into a new place. They had been inviting us to check it out, but we were quite busy so we couldn't meet. Kyle wanted me to go alone with our child, Debbie, but I was hesitant. He urged me to go so that his mother would stop calling him and asking him to check her new place out. Begrudgingly, I agreed to go during the weekend. Debbie had a friend's birthday party to attend that weekend, so I dropped her off and asked my mother to pick her up as Debbie loved spending time with her grandparents. It was a sunny Friday afternoon when I went to check out my in-laws' new place. The property was massive, and it looked like my father-in-law had spent a lot of money on it for his retirement. The house was huge and had a mix of modern and classic styles. The yard was really nice, with lots of green plants and flowers that smelled great. When I got there and rang the doorbell, my mother-in-law opened the door, perhaps thinking it was Kyle. She looked excited at first, but then she saw it was just me. She looked confused and asked me where Kyle and Debbie were. I told her that Kyle had an appointment and Debbie had to attend her friend's birthday. This really upset her and she started complaining about how selfish we all were to not find any time to spend with her. I tried to change the topic awkwardly by telling her that I was there and that I would love to check out her new place. She smiled a bit sadly and invited me inside. The inside of the house was just as fancy. The entrance had high ceilings, and everything was nicely decorated. My sister-in-law, Sil, Haley, and her 11-year-old son, Jake, were there too. I gave them a friendly greeting. Sil, much like her mom, never seemed to be a fan of mine. I couldn't figure out if it was a personal issue or just to make her mom happy, but she rarely engaged with me. Mill informed me that Phil was out with his friends, so she had invited Haley and her son over to spend some quality time with them. I nodded, trying to be polite, and attempted to strike up a conversation with Sil's son by asking how school was going for him. While we were discussing the boys' school, Mill suddenly shifted the conversation to her recent clothing purchases. She mentioned how she had wanted me to come over so I could give her some advice on her new wardrobe. This caught me off guard because she never sought my advice on anything before. I tried to hide my surprise and responded with a polite, "Oh, that's nice. I'd be happy to help." It felt a bit strange, given our history, but I decided to see the positive side and embrace the opportunity to bond over something as simple as fashion. She seemed pleased with my response and led the way towards what she proudly referred to as her pride and joy, the newly built walk-in closet. As we approached the impressive display of clothes, shoes, and accessories, I couldn't help but appreciate the lavish collection she had amassed. While I was admiring the outfits, Mill eagerly began showing me different pieces, asking for my opinion on colors, styles, and accessories. It was a bit surreal, given our rocky history, but I tried my best to be helpful and provide thoughtful suggestions. My Mill then encouraged me to look through her closet and that she would be right back. I nodded and was checking out her new clothes when I heard the pattering of feet running behind me. Before I could even look back, with mischievous laughter, Sil's son, Jake, gave me a push, causing me to stumble into the closet, and swiftly locked the door behind me. I fell face first into the closet. My head and teeth hurt with the impact. I couldn't comprehend at first what had just happened. The initial shock gave way to a sense of confinement and panic as I realized that Jake had turned off the light switch which was outside the closet door and had locked me in. I was enveloped in darkness and felt claustrophobic. Shocked and terrified, I began banging on the closet door, desperately calling out to Mill and Sil for help. However, my pleas seemed to fall on deaf ears, or perhaps they were conveniently ignoring my distress. I fumbled for my phone, hastily switching on my phone's flashlight. Anxiety crept in as I noticed my dwindling battery, making me worried that my phone might die before I could escape the confined closet. You see, I have had an irrational fear of darkness ever since I was a child. I had locked myself by mistake in my grandmother's closet while playing hide and seek with her, and my grandmother, who was hard of hearing given her age, had taken an agonizing hour to finally find me stuck in the closet crying and screaming. The sheer terror of that moment lingered, leaving me with an irrational fear that surfaced whenever I found myself enveloped in darkness. I continuously attempted to reach out to Mill and Sil for assistance. Unfortunately, my calls went unanswered, and a growing sense of isolation enveloped me. I was confused as to why they wouldn't pick up my calls even though I could hear them laughing loudly downstairs. In a last-ditch effort, I decided to dial my husband's number, in desperation. After a few rings, he casually answered. Desperation in my voice, I explained the dire situation. "Kyle, thank goodness you picked up. Something terrible has happened, and I need your help." Kyle, seemingly unfazed, inquired about what was going on. I proceeded to recount the incident. "Your nephew just pushed me and locked me inside the closet at your mom's place. He has switched off the lights. I have been banging on the door, but no one has come to rescue me. You know how terrified I am of dark spaces." Kyle, less sympathetic, retorted, "Are you seriously calling me in the middle of my work for this? This isn't even an emergency. Just call my mother who is inside the house instead of calling me." Frustrated, I replied that I did call his mother and his sister several times but they were not picking up. I explained how I didn't have a lot of charge on my phone to begin with and switching on my phone's flashlight was also draining my battery more. I begged him to come over and help me as he knew how scared I was of the darkness. I had talked to him at length about this. Kyle, unmoved by what I had just told him, stated, "Locked in a closet? Seriously? No, I can't come over as I am busy right now, so find someone else to help you." To my dismay, he nonchalantly dismissed my continued plea for help and cut the call short. I was stunned by his reaction. The growing panic within me pushed me to continue banging on the closet door, desperately calling Mill and Sil, but their phones remained stubbornly silent. Feeling trapped and helpless, I decided to call my father-in-law, Phil, since he was now the only person left who I could call. I knew he had been out with his friends, but I had no one else to turn to. The phone rang, and I held my breath, hoping he would answer. He picked up and I nervously explained the situation, revealing that Jake had locked me in the closet, and despite my attempts to reach out to others, no one was responding. He immediately assured me that he would make his way back home as quickly as possible and was shocked that Mill and Sil couldn't hear me all this while. After what felt like an eternity, I heard voices outside. I could recognize my Phil yelling something and he seemed to be directing someone to unlock the closet door. My anxiety began to subside as I realized help was finally on its way. The door creaked open, and I squinted against the sudden light. Sil and Phil stood there, wearing a mix of concern and frustration on their faces. I came out of the closet a bit disoriented but grateful for the release from that confined space. Phil asked Mill why I was locked in her closet and she started to feign innocence. I recounted the incident to everyone, detailing how Jake had pushed me into the closet and locked it. However, both Mill and Sil scoffed at my words, dismissing them entirely. They insisted that Jake would never do something like that. Frustrated and angry, I questioned why they hadn't come to check on me or respond to my banging on the door. Their excuse was that they were in the backyard, where Mill was showing Haley and Jake her new rose garden. Jake was peeking from the door, so I directed my anger at him and started to question him about why he would lock me inside, but Sil interrupted me. She told me that her son would never do such a thing and started to claim that I must have closed the door myself, and the key must have fallen out. Their blatant lies left me beside myself with frustration and disbelief as it still didn't explain how the lights got turned off then. My Phil tried to calm me down and I knew that regardless of what I said, Mill and Esther would continue to defend each other. Defeated and hurt, I returned home. I called my mother on my way apologizing that I couldn't come and pick Debbie up for the night and she might have to stay over at their place. I was trembling with shock and my mother knew that something was wrong, but I did not have the energy to tell her at the moment what had just happened. I reached home and waited for my husband to return so I could confront him about what his family had done to me. However, to my disbelief, when I recounted the incident to him during dinner, he berated me for overreacting and started accusing me of being childish. He insisted that this was a ridiculous accusation to make about his family. He refused to believe that his nephew could have locked me inside the closet and his mother and sister had knowingly refused to help me. He continued to justify his action on why he couldn't come to help me, saying that he wasn't at my beck and call, so I needed to be more understanding. With everyone gaslighting me, I started to doubt myself. In an attempt to avoid further conflict, I chose not to argue with him any further. I retreated to bed, enveloped by a profound loneliness, struggling to understand what had happened. The weight of the incident pressed heavily on my chest, and the feeling of being dismissed and misunderstood by my husband lingered. I knew that what had happened to me wasn't merely a prank, it was intentional, calculated, and deeply humiliating, since everyone pretty much had an idea that I was afraid of the dark. The following day, while I was at home grappling with the emotional aftermath of the previous day's ordeal, I received a TikTok link from my cousin. She asked if the video featured me. Opening the link, I was quickly horrified to see that my nephew, Jake, had recorded the entire incident and shamelessly posted it for his followers on TikTok. He was clearly telling his followers how he wanted to prank me, and locking me inside the dark closet was the perfect plan. He hid the camera in a corner and then ran to push me inside. My blood boiled in anger seeing his laughter. Infuriated, I shared the video in our family chat, demanding that everyone now owe me an apology since I had proof. I also wrote to Sil that she needed to get Jake to delete the video immediately. Instead of acknowledging the severity of the situation, Mill brushed it off, and instead told me that this was really funny to watch. She said that she had not seen anything more hilarious than this and claimed that boys will be boys. Sil joined in with her and insisted that I shouldn't be bothered by the video and just let this go as Jake had played a harmless prank on me anyway. I warned them that if Jake didn't remove this video I would be going the legal way. Mill replied back saying that I was just being too much right now and that I needed to chill out and learn to be a part of the family. Fed up with their lack of empathy, I decided to take matters into my own hands and teach them all a lesson. I called the cops immediately and provided them with the evidence of the incident. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, they agreed to give Sil a visit to question her about why her 11-year-old child had a TikTok account and was posting such prank videos by pushing people into closets. Later, Sil called me angrily asking if I seriously had the audacity to file a complaint against her. I told her that I had and that I was willing to take this to court. She started yelling at me some more, but I quickly told her that I was recording the conversation and would be happy to give it to my lawyer. She quickly shut up after that. So Ida for teaching my husband's family a lesson for locking me inside the closet for over an hour? Update 1. In just a few hours, I have received thousands of comments and I am glad to see that a majority of you understand why I decided to involve the police. I have been receiving multiple calls from my in-laws who are asking me to withdraw my statement to the police. No official case has been filed yet as my nephew is still a child, so the police are investigating to assess and determine the appropriate course of action. My husband, who had no idea about this, erupted when he came back from work. He had tried calling me during the day but I had been busy with the police, but when he was back, I knew we were going to have this conversation. Kyle is convinced that what I have done has totally destroyed the family and is saying that I shouldn't be so childish as to overreact over such harmless things. He continues to believe that Jake is just a child, hence he shouldn't be punished for this. I have talked with my parents and my sister about this. My family knows about my phobia for dark spaces, hence they are shocked that no one came to rescue me and more importantly that my husband isn't advocating for me. My dad had a strong word with my husband telling him that if I had called him for help while stuck in the dark closet, then it should have been his responsibility to either come to help me or immediately call his parents to get me out. The fact that he didn't do either of these things doesn't sit right with me or my family. Thanks to everyone's comments, I can see that my husband and his family's dismissive attitude has been going on for a long time and I have been blind to it. I will continue to update you when there is any further development. Update 2. It's been a week since my last update and there has been a major development. You see, Sil's husband, Vic, who was out of town, recently returned and he found out about what had happened between me and Jake. He completely lost it and asked my nephew to immediately take down the video and apologize to me personally. When Sil tried to defend her son's actions, Vic threatened to kick him out if he ever disrespected others like that. This was all told to me by Vic when he visited me. I agreed to meet up in the hopes that I could get to the bottom of this incident. Vic came to our place with Jake, who looked sad as if he had probably been scolded the entire time. Vic looked at him sternly as Jake immediately started to apologize to me as soon as we sat down to talk. He then started telling me that even though he did push me into the closet, it wasn't entirely his fault. I looked at him curiously and so did Vic. Jake went on to reveal that he would talk to Mill about his TikTok account as well as forward her several prank videos which his friends would play on other people. Once, she started to tell him how it would be a good idea to try it on someone in real life. Jake told her that he didn't think it was a good idea to try it on his family members, but Mill urged him, saying that because I wasn't technically his family since I was just married to my husband, then that meant he could definitely try out those pranks on me and not feel guilty about it. I was shocked to hear this. Vic asked Jake if he was lying and trying to dodge responsibility as this was a huge accusation to make, but Jake started weeping, telling us that we were welcome to check his phone where he and Mill did indeed have a conversation regarding this. He showed us those chats and I was absolutely horrified and disgusted. For someone her age to incite a child to engage in such actions simply because she disliked me was truly appalling. Having heard enough, I promptly saved those screenshots to my phone and emphatically advised Jake against following her suggestions, emphasizing that it was the wrong course of action. Jake nodded solemnly. Vic, equally taken aback, expressed his dismay, stating how sickening it was, making him reconsider allowing his child to be around my mother-in-law. Understandingly, I nodded as he continued, expressing regret for not being present to prevent Jake's actions that day. He urged me to not go through with the case and retract my statement with the police since Jake had spoken the truth. Vic was clearly afraid of the impact this would have on his child's life. I assured them that I would discuss the matter with my lawyer and the police, on the condition that Jake never uploaded the video again or retained a copy of it. Jake assured me that he had indeed deleted the video and that he had no copy of it remaining. Since this conversation with Vic and Jake, I have started questioning my entire relationship with Mill. It's pretty clear now that she was behind the attack and encouraged a child to do her dirty deed so that she could get away with it. I can't allow myself to be around her ever again, as I don't know what else she might do to me if she already dislikes me this much. Update 3. Hello guys. It's been 4 months since my last update. I have moved out of my husband's place and I am currently staying with my parents. As updated previously, my evil Mill was behind everything. When I confronted her about it, she refused to accept her mistakes even after I showed her the screenshots. She tried to accuse my nephew, saying that he must have manipulated them and photoshopped it. Her lies quickly fell apart once I threatened that I would pursue this legally if she didn't admit her mistakes. Me then begrudgingly admitted that she had pre-planned this with my nephew, and when she saw that I had come alone to visit her, she thought this would be the perfect time to play the prank on me. She continued to say how Sil was in on it too and that they had enjoyed hearing my scream for help. She begged me to not pursue this further, saying that she would never do this to me again. Fortunately, for me, I had recorded our entire conversation, so I simply ended the call with her and forwarded the voice recording to our group chat so that everyone could hear what Mill had admitted. I sent a text to Sil saying that I had never expected her to go so low and that I hoped her son would turn out to be a better human being than her. As for my husband, our relationship just became worse and worse every day. Even with the screenshots and voice recording of his own mother admitting her mistake, my husband never once apologized to me for what his family had put me through. I think seeing my family rallying behind me really made me understand that this was not me overreacting and that what had happened to me was in fact a big deal. Although I did decide to not take any legal action, I didn't want to forgive and forget what the family had done to me. There was no going back after this, and with my husband continuing to support them, there was nothing left for me to fight for. I tried to save my marriage, but when your own partner supports his mother's evil actions regardless of your feelings, then you start to slowly realize that you deserve better than this. I moved out so that we could eventually start our divorce proceedings. He wasn't even remotely surprised about this and didn't fight me when I announced to him that I wanted a divorce. I won't lie about this, as it has been extremely hard to go through this. I genuinely loved my husband and thought I would grow old with him, but these last few months have been eye-opening and I deserve to put myself first. I am really glad that everyone in the comment section and my family made me see the truth about my husband and his family.